Vi befinner oss på Engelsbergs bruk i Bergslagen där 2023 års Engelsbergsseminarium äger rum. Temat i år är Leadership and Statecraft. I det pass vi nu ska få ta del av tas en del ledarskapsfrågor från det 21:a århundradet upp. Allt ifrån hur nya eliter kan skolas in i statsmannaskap till de svenska NATO-förhandlingarna med Turkiet.
I'm tempted to quote Henry IV before the Battle of Agincourt. We few, we happy few, we band of sisters and brothers. Munira, Mirza, welcome up on the stage to tell us how future leaders are bred in the United Kingdom.
I'm not an academic scholar. I'm something of a recent practitioner in government. I've worked in and around government for around 15 years, and most recently in number 10 Downing Street. I left government last year, and when I left, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about a paradox in Britain today, which is that as a country, we've never been so well educated. We've never had so many people going to university. We're a magnet for global talent in many different sectors, in finance, in tech, in the creative arts, in law, you name it. And yet, despite having such a high stock of human capital, our political class seems more inadequate and ineffective than ever. Generally, when you look throughout history, the increase in the average level of intelligence of a country will lead to an increase in the sophistication of the political leadership. And it seems, for some strange reason, that in Britain, and I would argue perhaps in, I can see this talk may resonate in other countries as well, but it seems that we're living through a moment where there's been a divergence between the general intelligence and the political elite. Like I say, I've worked in government, so I don't say this in a flippant and just a comical way. And in Britain, there's something of a national sport where armchair critics, opinion writers, columnists, perhaps some of you in this room, have a tendency to mock politicians and the people who run government. So I recognise that there's something of a comedic element in this, but there is also something serious, I think, going on. And I recognise that many of my former colleagues working in government, you've heard a couple of them in this conference, many talented individuals actually do work in government. But I think it's fair to say that there is a problem in the wider system of public leadership in the UK. And this is something that's been widely acknowledged by people across the political spectrum. The quality of decision-making in public institutions and in government can often be quite poor. There can sometimes be an inability to think long-term. There is sometimes a lack of institutional memory and of policy knowledge, both domestic and foreign policy knowledge amongst legislators, parliamentarians. And there's often a failure amongst political parties to be able to communicate or even articulate a vision that can cohere people and bring people along. And the result of these problems is an overall decline in public trust in government and a growing cynicism about what government can do to improve people's lives. As I say, many commentators have noted this phenomenon. At the beginning of this conference, Henry Kissinger was cited from his latest book on leadership, and he suggests in his final chapter of that book that it's almost impossible for great world leaders to emerge today for various reasons: the rise of social media, the lack of deep literacy, the changing education system in many developed nations. But I would like to talk a bit about what I think is happening in the UK and some factors that I think are specific to our system. And then perhaps, hopefully, if I have some time at the end, I might suggest one or two solutions. So in the UK context, the first thing that most people would point to is that there are some fairly clear structural reasons why our political leadership seems to be failing. And the first is that what economists would call a classic misallocation of capital problem. If you're a young person in your 20s, you don't want to go and work in politics or government because it's relatively poorly paid and seen as increasingly low status. So a smart young person in their 20s will go into business or the professions, or perhaps even go and work in an NGO where they can gain the esteem of their peers and be able to build a career. And that then creates a doom loop effect. If fewer good people go into politics, it makes it less good, less attractive, and then even fewer people want to join that group. The drain of talent away from public life is happening despite the fact that actually there's more interest in politics and political education than ever. So UK universities have more and more courses now for undergraduates and postgraduates in politics, public policy. But many of the graduates of those courses will actually go on into the private sector or the non-governmental sector. And that's the same, in fact, of the Oxford PPE course, which is famous in Britain for being something of a talent pipeline for future prime ministers. But the majority of people on that course won't go into the civil service, and only a small number will eventually go into frontline politics. Also, the most prestigious institutions in the UK that teach political education don't actually teach the majority students from the UK. So the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, which is one of the most prestigious schools now for public policy in the world, it was set up to be a UK equivalent of the Kennedy School in Harvard. About 80 to 90% of the cohort for their Masters in Public Policy is actually from abroad. And the LSE is another very prestigious university for teaching public policy. 70% of the student body at the LSE is foreign-born. Now, these are fantastic institutions, and it's excellent that they attract so many students from around the world. But the UK is very good at educating the world's leaders, but I think less concerned or less focused on educating perhaps the UK's own leaders. So the bigger question for me is, why has this state of affairs been allowed to continue? Why have we been so supremely relaxed about these structural factors? All successful societies throughout history have given much thought to the question of what I would call elite formation. Just as any family or business might do succession planning, societies have found ways to identify talented people to lead, and found ways to educate them and prepare them for the challenges ahead. Probably the most famous story in biblical times of succession planning is Moses handing over to Joshua. God says to Moses, you can reach the promised land, but you're not allowed to enter. You'll die before you go in. And Moses, in a state of anxiety, has to find a new leader. And God tells him to choose Joshua, who has effectively been apprenticed to him for about 40 years. As Adrian Wooldridge documents in his excellent book, The Aristocracy of Talent, different societies have found different ways and created different institutions to go and find smart, intelligent, and motivated people to run their countries. In Imperial China, in around 600, they introduced a national written exam, which any male in the country could enter. It was very, very competitive, very rigorous, and if you passed, you then had entry into the life of a bureaucrat, which was high status and relatively high paid. In more modern times, European nations and latterly America and other developed countries have created universities, grammar schools, public schools, again, to find intelligent, talented people and to prepare them both with the knowledge and the expertise to run countries, but also the character and the values and the ethics of being great leaders. It's something of a cliche in Britain that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. And this idea that education and training and preparation was an important part of these institutions' purpose. So what's happened in Britain to the idea of elite formation? I'd suggest that something profound shifted in the culture, and this is me speculating rather than using data and evidence, but I speculate that in around the 80s and 90s, there was a shift in the idea of elite formation, and fundamentally, institutions and the elite themselves started to become more democratic and egalitarian, which is a very good thing, less focused on class difference. But with that went away the idea of the noblesse oblige, the aristocratic kind of elite that had a sense of their role, their responsibility for being custodians of the nation. Instead, the new elite were talented individuals with careers to pursue and families to look after. And that sense of being, having some duty to the nation, I think has faded away. Around the same time, universities also changed their funding models. They were no longer taking funding from central government, but forced to take funding through a tuition fee model. So they started to think of themselves as providers of a product to consumers. And of course, over time, they weren't thinking just about students in the UK, but about global consumers, foreign international students, and therefore started to think of themselves as powerhouses of global talent. Again, fantastic for those institutions, fantastic for research and for cultural exchange and all those good things. But what's happened, I think, is that in those changes, we have lost the sense of who is responsible for training a future elite, who's in charge of that job. Another change, which I think is sometimes overlooked, is the fact that political parties themselves have stopped thinking about their talent pipeline. So political parties used to be, in the UK, mass membership organisations. In the 1950s, around 1 in 10 people in the UK would have been members of a political party, about 5 million people. It's now a tenth of that size. So political party membership has shrunk. And political parties themselves no longer provide political education. People in Britain are often surprised when I tell them that both the Conservative and the Labour Party had colleges, and they produced pamphlets and leaflets about political philosophy and economics, and people would travel to these colleges and hear lectures and meet people from other parts of the country. There was a vast social network that was dedicated to training activists and training people in political thought, and all that has basically fallen away. As a result, many of the people who come into politics now don't receive really any kind of political education unless you've done a degree in PPE, and we should remember that really only a minority do. Most of the people who come into Parliament haven't had really any grounding in public policy or economics or political philosophy or any of the things we've been hearing about over the last 2 or 3 days. They're expected to sort of pick it up for themselves, figure out for themselves what they believe and what they understand of the world. Meanwhile, the civil service, which is non-elected, these are the officials in government, their most prestigious national institution, Sunningdale College, was closed down in 2012. So the one institution that was designed to train civil servants in areas of knowledge and expertise also was closed down. There have been attempts in recent years to try and resurrect something of that training, but it's been very difficult. And perhaps most damaging of all, I would argue, is that the very idea of meritocracy, the importance of recruiting the best, the most excellent people, has itself become quite unfashionable. So if you look at the website for civil service recruitment in Britain, there's a lot of emphasis on inclusion and representation and diversity, but compare that to the Singaporean civil service website, which uses the word excellence. That's not a word that you see very often when we talk about the civil service in Britain. It's almost a boo word. It's a word that seems something that perhaps we're slightly embarrassed about. Why did we stop caring? Why do we allow this lack of training and preparation to continue? I would argue that in the last 2 decades, probably longer, there has been a kind of complacency in Britain and perhaps in other developed nation states about how hard it is to protect a nation state, how fragile and how vulnerable our situation is. I think that an elite believed that we were living through the end of history, we were living through the end of boom and bust, that we were in a period of relative stability and security. And therefore, finding the best people wasn't so urgent. It wasn't as much of a necessity. We could have the luxury of creating a more diverse and inclusive political class and not worry so much if they weren't up to the job. I don't think people thought this explicitly or said it explicitly, but I think there was a kind of a sense that we could all relax because it almost didn't matter too much if we didn't have the best people running the country, because frankly, the country can run itself. And as we've heard in the last few days, we're now much more aware of the kind of existential threats that we do face and the kinds of vulnerabilities that we do have. In fact, the countries that have the best elite formation, that I think invest most in talent and in preparation of the political elite, Singapore and Israel, it's not a coincidence that they are countries that are very, very aware, and from the start of their independence were very aware of threats on their doorstep, and have therefore judged elite formation to be very important.
Can you make it?
I certainly can, possibly even less time. So what can be done? What must be done, as Lenin would say? I would argue first that we must treat elite formation again as something to consciously strive for, to consciously rediscover in our best institutions. And that means universities, the civil service, other public institutions give much greater thought to the idea that they are responsible for finding the best people and for training them. Of course, trying to find the best people from the largest pool of talent and not through some narrow elitist pipeline in the old-fashioned sense, but certainly trying to attract good people into those worlds again. And there are many other specific policy prescriptions I could make, but I don't think I would have time. And the second is, I think that as in previous eras, as previous societies have done, I think we need new institutions and new experiments to develop elite statecraft. And if I can use my final minute to give a plug, a shameless plug for a new organisation that I set up called Civic Future, civicfuture.org, if you want to look us up. We're not for profit, and we're in the business of finding good people to go into public life, people who come from other sectors, other professions, who are very motivated to serve but currently don't know how to go into politics, or who haven't gone through the standard civil service recruitment process. And we believe that it's important to teach political philosophy and history, and also to prepare people for the challenges ahead. We've heard about AI in this conference. Obviously, we've talked a lot about geopolitics. The importance of preparing people in understanding the world as it is today, so that they're better able to make decisions about the future. And crucially, as part of that education, to build the network again, to build the human relationships that used to exist through which we transmitted political education and learning. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, please come and talk to me afterwards, but I will leave it there, I think. Thank you.
Are universities focusing on sort of the wrong kind of training? I'm a little tempted to paraphrase T.S. Eliot. Where is the statecraft lost in public policy? Where is the public policy that was lost at 10 Downing Street? Say more and more enroll in political subjects at universities, but is the focus wrong?
So others can comment better than me on the content of these courses. I think lots of the politics courses focus a lot on polling and data analysis for obvious reasons. People who work in public affairs and so on will find those skills very useful. And there are, and this is it would be a crude generalization to say they're all focusing on the wrong things, but there's certainly an emphasis more on what I would call the kind of technocratic aspects of politics. But I think it's more about the broader question, the broader culture, and why it is that many people from other fields who might study science subjects or study the creative arts, that perhaps in the past those people would have felt that there was a route for them to engage in politics, and that has changed a great deal. So whilst I think that there's much that could be fixed in the university education in politics, I think it's a broader problem as well.
Yeah. Another problem, at least in Sweden, is that politicians are becoming a breed of their own. Could it become sort of more open so that you could go into politics later in life with all the outside experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, I've met lots of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who always thought that they would go into public life in some way, and then realized that they haven't engaged or been part of a political network, and actually they don't know how to do it. We often complain in Britain that not enough people come from outside the law or outside Westminster, and yet we haven't, as a country, really created the networks or the channels by which people can come in from those fields. So I think that's a big problem for us. You
said that Singapore and Israel are excellent. What about France, who has this ENR breeding their famous enarchs?
Well, I'm wise enough not to start talking about other people, other countries' institutions. There may be others in the audience who can comment. I mean, these are all very prestigious public policy organisations. Obviously, the Kennedy School I mentioned. But it is noticeable how the ones, certainly in the UK, they do not necessarily lead to people then going on into frontline politics. But it's not to say that they aren't excellent institutions. They do a very good job in many ways. But when I set up Civic Future, I wanted a curriculum that both taught about the practical, technical aspects of policy making, but also tied it back to history and political philosophy and questions of geopolitics. That sense of the breadth of what a political life entails and the kind of knowledge that Kissinger talks about in his book. I think that doesn't really exist in the kinds of curricula you see. That universities have become more and more specialised in their approach. And I think that there is a need for a general education that allows people, not just in the space of 1 or 2 years, but over a lifetime. And many of the statesmen and stateswomen we've heard about in this conference came into politics relatively late or became great leaders in their 60s and 70s. We now ask MPs to do the job in their 20s and 30s. It's it should be a lifetime of preparation.
Thank you very much. Will Sweden and Turkey ever come to terms? Can the East meet the West? Nathan? I'm sure you have a clear answer to this.
I'm going to talk about what went wrong. And I don't know, honestly, if it's going to sort itself out, soon or late. Vladimir Putin is a strong leader, but is he an example of strong leadership? Putin can kill his subjects or jail them if they oppose him, so they obey. But good leadership is the opposite, when you convince people to do something they hesitate to do. I have seen that myself up close 3 times. First, with the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, who made peace with Israel in the face of extreme threats and protests from the entire Arab world. And then, with the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who carried on making peace with the Palestinians in spite of violence and incitement. And a third time, I saw it with Brazilian President Lula da Silva. When Lula was elected in 2003, his own leftist camp and his enemies expected populism and big spending. Instead, Lula kept the currency stable, tariffs low, and he saved the economy. Sadat and Rabin were murdered for what they did by their own countrymen. Sadat's legacy, the Israeli-Egyptian peace, is still a cornerstone of regional stability. Rabin's work, the Israeli-Palestinian peace, has been destroyed. Lula is now back in office, but paralyzed by a hostile Congress and moving closer to Russia and China. Recently, we've been given a live experiment in leadership during the past year's wrangling between Sweden, Turkey, and NATO about Swedish accession to the alliance. Rarely have 2 countries displayed such wildly different tactics during a crisis. Turkey demanding, denouncing, preaching, and insulting. Sweden hoping, pleading, groveling, and appealing to the Turks' good faith. This contrast reflects a deep difference between these 2 cultures. The Russian attack against Ukraine shook up many countries, but few more than Sweden. There were 3 reasons. We're next door to Russia. We're almost defenseless. In the 1970s, Sweden had impressive armed forces, including a huge air force. But now, if they were our neighbors, the Palestinian Authority forces in Ramallah, 70,000 soldiers, could overrun Sweden in weeks, if not days. And the third reason Sweden was thrown into anxiety was that the events in the Ukraine challenged a pillar of our identity and self-regard, the neutrality policy, almost a religion here until quite recently. The first reaction of the Social Democrat government was loud and shrill. We will never abandon neutrality, never join NATO. In a little while, that same government declared we must join NATO at any cost. This abrupt U-turn was not the result of any sober reflection. It was simply politicians realizing that the public had changed its mind. It was the opposite of leadership. It was the public leading and the leaders following. It became obvious that the people running the country had never reflected on strategic issues. They had grown up after 1989 in the delusion that defense and danger and strategy were history. And then, about around 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they all but abolished our defense forces. When Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO, there were no Turkish objections. But soon, someone in Ankara realized that this was an opportunity to get some important things, to squeeze concessions from Sweden, and more importantly, from the Americans. The Turks published a long list of harsh conditions for accepting Sweden. After a summit in Madrid a year ago, a memorandum was drawn up where Sweden promised to get tougher on PKK activities in Sweden and to extradite terrorists. Immediately after signing in Madrid, President Erdogan said that he expected Sweden to hand over 73 wanted Turks living in Sweden, many of them journalists, none of them terrorists in any objective sense. Sweden was shocked, but it was clever Turkish tactics. It put the Swedes on the defensive and sent them looking for other concessions in order to appease the Turks. This atmosphere of crisis and clashing values served Erdogan well. It showed him as a defender of national interests and as a key player in NATO during his election campaign. In Sweden, the Social Democrats lost the election and a conservative coalition took over. That changed nothing. Swedish Prime Minister went to Turkey. The Foreign Minister went. Others went. They all went without anything having been settled in advance. They hoped to break the ice by showing friendliness. But they were given cool receptions, returned empty-handed. The Swedes all along this repeated how well they understood the Turkish position and how hard they would strive to make things right. The way Swedish politicians humiliated themselves before the Turks made it hard not to think of the Stockholm Syndrome, where captives identify with hijackers and kidnappers. This looked like masochism, but it was really something else. There is in modern Swedish culture an inclination to look for common ground. Always. Dramatic economic and political conflicts have been solved peacefully during the 20th century here. In 1931, 5 striking workers were shot by the police, an event still remembered by everybody because it was so unique. But Turkey isn't Sweden. During its entire modern history, Turkish regimes have killed their citizens, Armenians, Kurds, Alevites, leftists of all kinds. They put Jews and Greeks in slave labor camps. Sweden, entering modernity, was an extremely homogeneous country. Turkey was extremely varied, ethnically, religiously, language-wise. But the official national culture of the Turkish Republic has always been one of Turkish unity. Turkey had a multicultural population, but pretended that it didn't. Sweden, on the other hand, declared itself multicultural formally in 1978, even though it wasn't. In international comparisons, Sweden rates very high, both in interpersonal trust and in citizens' trust of the state. Turkey rates low. Most Swedes trust other Swedes until proven wrong, while most Turks mistrust other Turks until proven wrong. Swedish governments have also trusted foreign leaders to a remarkable degree. They have believed Fidel Castro and African tyrants. They even believed Moscow when it swore that it had no idea what had happened to the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who was disappeared by the Soviets in 1945. So while Sweden was eager to build confidence and profess partnership, the Turkish approach was varied between transactional and very melodramatic. The friendly Swedish gestures inspired no mercy in Ankara. Instead, the Turks correctly interpreted Swedish friendliness as proof that their tactics worked. At some stage, the Swedish game became dysfunctional. It yielded no results and it caused damage. But the government pushed on. The low point was reached on November the 5th last year when Sweden broke with Rojava, the de facto Kurdish state in northern Syria. The Syrian Kurds, who were close to the PKK, but also leftists and feminists, had been Sweden's favorite foreign aid project. Even more so after the Battle of Kobani 8 years ago when the Syrian Kurds helped NATO defeat Daesh, the Islamic State. Normally such a painful concession, breaking with the Kurds of Syria, would have been reciprocated and given maybe near the end of negotiations. But Sweden got nothing in return. It was just one more friendly gesture, wasting one of Sweden's few strong cards. So now, after having given up its cherished neutrality, Sweden had also betrayed its very first commandment, human rights. It had dropped a small, brave ally in order to placate a bully, and it didn't work. Turkey became no friendlier, and many Swedes started to get disgusted by the whole NATO idea. Swedish leadership had achieved the opposite of leadership. It had diminished broad public support for NATO accession. Sweden used to be warlike and ruthless, just like Turkey, and just like most powers used to be. Sweden knew how to be bad in the old days. In 1712, Altona, the second largest city of Denmark, was burned to the ground by the Swedes. They did that rather than to plunder the city in order to project fear. But after Sweden lost its huge dominions around the Baltic Sea and became again a small, insignificant country, it changed its warlike image. After the loss of Finland in 1809, the national poet Tegnér called on Swedes to build great things at home, to invent and explore and expand in non-territorial ways, to build another Finland in our minds and hearts. And they did. Part of this self-reinvention was a new self-image. Sweden was now proud to be peaceful, neutral and empathetic with the weak. This has gone very far. For a Swedish leader or political party to speak of Sweden's greatness, its glorious past, to appeal to national pride would be almost impossible. Even our right-wing extremists, the SD party, doesn't sound very fearsome. In Turkey, it's the other way around. A leader in Turkey who cannot project power and give voice to national pride would be doomed. Sweden wants to be liked. Turkey wants to be respected and sometimes feared. Sweden and Turkey are antipodes in the way they see themselves and in the roles they want to play in the world. They're both stuck in a mold. I think both of them would be better off facing the world without their immature self-images. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for this refreshing view on Sweden and on Turkey. We are desperately looking for signs that Erdogan will finally concede and accept Swedish membership, hopefully before the top meeting in Vilnius. And now we have seen that he's not going to send Parliament away on summer holidays at the beginning of July. Parliament is expected to stay. Could that be a sign that he's prepared to ratify the Swedish membership?
I wouldn't know. But I would be surprised if Erdogan gave Sweden a green light before arranging this important aircraft business with the Americans. If the Americans don't give them, the Americans have already denied them the airplane that they really wanted, that they participated in the planning of the F-35. Now at least they have to renew their air force, and they need something. So if they don't get the F-16 planes, I think Sweden will have to wait. It would be.
Are the planes more important than the extradition of the terrorists in Sweden, so-called terrorists?
Well, PKK. There are many PKK terrorists, but most of them are in other countries. There's nothing important PKK-wise taking place in Sweden. This has been a useful tactic, because Sweden has been soft on PKK, and there has been a lot of PKK activity, but it's not urgent for Turkey to get any wanted.
But in successful negotiations, you must let your opponent get away with something. Mr. Erdogan has to be able to go back to the Turkish people and say, we really twisted the arms of the Swedes.
Well, they have already twisted the arms of the Swedes in many ways, and Sweden has even changed its very controversially.
He could declare himself a winner right now.
Oh, I'm not without anything more from the Americans.
Okay, so the Americans are the key.
I think.
But what's the role that NATO has played? Why hasn't Stoltenberg been more active?
I think he's been very soft on Turkey, and Erdogan has enjoyed. Stoltenberg came to talk to him, and he had to wait for almost 2 days before Erdogan found time to meet him. So this is, there's nothing painful in this for the Turkish government. Time is not running out for them or anything like that.
Kori, Schake, welcome back to Engelsberg. We started this conference with myths and mythlessness, so it's quite appropriate that you end with leadership without mythology.
Thank you, my friend. It is a joy to be back here in this vibrant community. And it is true that I think that one of the major fallacies in our approach to statecraft is to believe that there was a dreamy mythological time when American political leaders were great statesmen, right? Instead of tawdry domestic politicians shackled everywhere they turn. And there was a mythological time when America's allies were subservient and not a pain in the ass the way Turkey always is. And I'm a historian of the American experience, and I keep looking for that time, and I can't find it. And let me just give a couple of examples of places where people like to imagine things were easier. One of my favorite examples is 1954, right? American GDP was still about 45% of the globe's economy. You had the most Atlanticist American president in history, Dwight Eisenhower, right? The great victor of the European campaign in World War II. You had the formation of the NATO alliance, and yet at this same time, You had the McCarthy hearings going on in the United States, with Dwight Eisenhower declining to intervene to prevent a Red Scare in our country. You had the American military forcibly integrating elementary schools in the American South. Eisenhower had castigated not only President Truman, but also George Marshall, his mentor, as deficient in American foreign policy. And the Eisenhower administration had had to threaten our NATO allies that unless they admitted Germany into the European defense community, there would be an agonizing reappraisal of America's commitment to Europe. And the underlying current was we would walk away from European security. And by the way, that threat did not work. Europeans still didn't admit Germany into the European defense community, despite the American threat to walk away in 1954 from Europe, from the defense of Europe. So math class isn't newly hard. Math class is always hard. Turkey is always difficult to deal with. It's not newly difficult to deal with. And yet, so my example is when I was working in the Pentagon in the 1990s, during a NATO exercise, the United States had mistakenly fired on a Turkish ship and not only damaged the ship, but killed a number of Turkish sailors. And General Powell, who was my boss, and Secretary Cheney went into a meeting with the Turks, prepared to publicly apologize, to offer to replace the ship, to pay compensation to both the Turkish government and Turkish families for the damage we had done. And the Turks rejected all of those things. They wanted to know the name of the American sailor who'd fired the missile because they were sure he was Greek. My second favorite example of how much fun it is to deal with Turkey is the kinds of demands they are making of you, they also make of us. They are convinced that the 2015 coup attempt against President Erdogan was fulminated in Pennsylvania by Gulenists. And they routinely demand the extradition of them from the United States. And the best the U.S. can do is say, the federal government doesn't have the ability to do that, but we will be willing to let you take it to a federal judge, and if you can convince them that of that case, then we will extradite. 3 times we have done that. None of the 3 judges believed the Turks had any basis for demanding extradition. And so we are back to square one with the Turks once again. I'll get to the 3 challenges of statecraft, but I want to say a little bit more about the problem with mythologizing the past. And it's not just the 1950s that are a problem. Throughout the 1970s, the American Congress threatened that unless Europeans paid more for their defense, we were going to start withdrawing American troops from Europe. And that also didn't work. And it always required contortions on the part of the American president to lie to the American Congress in order to keep Congress from legislating the withdrawal of American troops. So the reason that mythologizing the past is so damaging in statecraft is because it persuades us that our predecessors were better, nobler than we are, and therefore their job was easier than ours. American secretaries of defense routinely say, the world has never been more complicated. It's never been more dangerous. Franklin Roosevelt would object to that description. George Washington would object to that description. There has never been a time where American power was as predominant in the order. There has never been a time where American allies were stronger and more capable. There has never been a time when our challenges were actually as small relative to our power as now. So we should not excuse ourselves from doing the hard work at hand. Couple of points about structural difficulties of being an American ally. I'm very sympathetic to allied complaints about my sweet provincial country. And yet, if you can see a better bargain, you should take it. I'm not confident anybody sees a better bargain, so you just have to live and deal with us as a country in which any idiot can get elected president and very often does. As a country whose government is run by amateurs instead of well-seasoned and educated politicians. A couple of thousand political appointees come into the American government with any new presidential administration. Most of them have a commitment to the president's agenda rather than any knowledge about how to run the American government or, great historical examples. It's none of that. It's used car dealers from Tampa, Florida, who raised money to get the president elected. But that system also has advantages. You get the American political system is tied incredibly tightly to American public attitudes, and it's supposed to be that way, right? That Congress is in a perpetual election campaign, that the system is responsive to any president when they come in because they bring so many people in. And the disputatiousness of the system is because a few thousand people come in, you have an incredibly rich strategic debate in the United States because we're all the administration in waiting. That's why you have so many think tanks. That's why the American system is so porous to outside ideas. Let me just give you one example. When I was the poor taxpayer who had to run the 2005 military base closures process, Congress hates closing bases because it's good for local communities, economies. The military thinks we have a third too many military bases, and they want to shut them all in order to spend their money better. There's an elaborate process whereby you have to prove you've shut every overseas military base you can. You have to go around to all of the bases in the communities and see who you can afford to put the political pain on. The Congress can only say yes or no to the entire list, because that's the only way you can get anything. In the course of this process in 2005, it became evident that the German government was worried we were going to close bases in Germany, and they started lobbying all over the American Congress about the jobs created in America by. It's so exquisite that people understand how to lobby in our internal politics and do it well. But the other piece of the 2005 was that it became very political. In the run-up, when we were doing all this process in 2004, a presidential election got in the way. John Kerry got this great idea that the U.S. was punishing our allies who didn't support us on the Iraq War by closing bases overseas. And it threatened to derail Democratic votes in Congress for it. And so here's how I solved that problem. I took all the classified studies to Mike O'Hanlon, a prominent Democratic advisor to the Kerry campaign. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying this was good defense policy and shouldn't be politicized. And that handcuffed the opposition to support the base closures. That's how you get stuff done in the American government. It's tawdry, it's narrow-bore political, and yet that's what you're dealing with as an American ally. And so we're not good at a lot of stuff. It's a highly political process. It's an amateur's process. The mystery isn't that it goes wrong sometimes. The mystery is that you get as much consistency in America's approach to the world as you get. And the reason is because you actually have a very strong consensus in the American public. And I know our disgraced former president feels like an outlier to that, is an outlier to that. In 2015, you can track polling of American public attitudes on this. In 2015, candidate Trump said, allies are taking advantage of the United States, globalization has drawn American jobs overseas, and immigrants are taking our jobs. If I were good enough at my job, my mother wouldn't have voted for President Trump in 2016. But I had failed to connect my view of the world adequately with the average American voter. But what you saw within 2 years was when Americans saw the president's policies, they actually didn't like the application of it. And public attitudes swung by about 15%. 11% of my fellow Republicans crossed the line and voted for a Democrat for president, voted for Democrats in the Congress. So you get wide swings in attitude because we're almost always responding to what we don't like in our own policies. Yet you have strong continuity that people have rights and they loan them in limited ways to governments for agreed purposes. The United States isn't a good strategic power. We're not tough-minded enough. And we have too wide a margin for error. Unlike Israel or Singapore, we're not good at taking a hard line with allies. We like the people we like. And so that takes us to the three difficult statecraft problems: Turkey, Russia, and China. Turkey's going to be unpleasant about Swedish membership, and yet the US desperately wants to get it done. So the likely outcome, probably in the next 2 weeks, if I were betting my money, is going to be President Biden, who loathes President Erdogan, is going to have a big bilateral meeting, put his arm around his shoulders, congratulate him for his election, not say anything about the extent to which Erdogan has collapsed democracy in Turkey, not to say anything about how much we hope he will stop putting his opponents in jail so that he can run against a terrible candidate. And the president is going to cross his fingers behind his back and promise we are going to give F-16s to Turkey, even though Congress is in charge of that. And Senator Menendez, whose wife is an Armenian American, will do it over his dead body. Turkey's in a strong position. We want something badly that Turkey has control over. We're going to make the tawdry bargain, and we're going to hate the Turks a little bit more when we have to do it. The statecraft problem with Russia. What does post-war European security look like? Because it looks to me like we are just going to have to, we don't have a Putin problem, we have a Russia problem. And we are going to have to put the Russians in a cage until we get a Russia that has a different view of its present, its past, and its future than the Russians want right now. And that's going to require a lot of us, but fortunately we know how to do that together. And a smart Russian leader, so I was in Ukraine about 3 weeks ago, and the defense minister really surprised me by saying that he thinks the leadership transition in Russia has been going on since the fall. And that it's not that Prigozhin and people falling out of windows and the musical chairs among generals is Putin puppet mastering his subordinates. It's that he can't prevent it. He's no longer in a strong enough position to prevent it. And as time goes on, that feels more and more true to me. A smart Russian successor to Putin may well be worse than what we are looking at now, because I think Russian society is the problem. But a smart Russian successor would say, that was my predecessor's war, and try and get sanctions lifted and try and get themselves back into energy pipelines and the West. I'd say that's a 5% probability. So we're going to have to deal with this for a generation. And the third problem, easier than the Russia problem, although of greater magnitude, is what do you do about a China that wants to rewrite the rules of the international order? Here, the statecraft challenge is that we think we are looking at a stampedingly successful China, and we no longer are. We don't have the problems of a strong, prosperous China. We have the problems of a China marooned in the middle income trap that will not make the policy changes under this leadership to propel themselves out of it. Per capita GDP in China is $17,000. That's roughly the equivalent of the Dominican Republic. So different set of problems than we are prepared for, and maybe a more urgent set of problems than we are prepared for. Because the United States is good at dealing with rising powers, because they're nouveau riche and arrogant and swaggering. In fact, they're a lot like us, and we can craft mutually beneficial outcomes. We are bad at dealing with dead-end powers, countries that are willing to accept a bad outcome for others as long as it is a bad outcome for themselves, and that's what we are looking at with those three statecraft problems. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Putting Russia in a cage. What is this cage?
It is the admission of Sweden, and I think probably, here's my bet, that Ukraine gets admitted into NATO at the Washington summit on the anniversary of NATO's founding next year. It is moving forces forward to the new Central Front, which is Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and Bulgaria. Probably permanently stationed forces rather than rotational forces. It is trying to persuade Russia back into arms control agreements, as was discussed earlier. Even though they're cheating on all of them, it's important for our own alliance and our own publics to show we're trying to get that done, and to effectively deter the Russians in a way we are not yet against any nuclear use.
Which might make Russia even more dangerous, as I argued in the former session.
You know, I very much like the reminder that it's not in competitive swimming, it's not the line judge that disqualifies the swimmer, it's the swimmer that disqualifies the swimmer. We are not to blame for Russia's danger. Russia's to blame for Russia's danger. It's our job to deal with it.
But this is not a blame game. It's a war game. I mean, what's the use of blaming each other? I mean, Russia will still be dangerous, will feel even more threatened if there's a NATO build-up around Russia's borders.
And yet, they are posing threats that require that of us for the security of the people we're committed to defend.
Is Sergei here with any Chinese proverb? Never tease the tiger within the cage. We disagree. Let us disagree. Come and be a panel.
No, I'm not prepared to give you that just yet. Because the thank you for that solidarity, my friends and allies.
They're getting tired of me now, so I accept it.
The allowing the Russians to threaten us. We are the strong ones in this equation. Okay. They are losing a war to Ukraine. We should not be afraid of the dangers they pose. We should be shaping and constraining the dangers they pose.
Thank you.